History class is supposed to show you the world as it is, but in practice, it's usually the world as someone wants you to see it. These are the lies and omissions from humanity's greatest stories that every student of history needs to know.
A Polish cavalry officer named Witold Pilecki walked into a crowd of people in Warsaw. They were being rounded up by German officers in preparation to be sent to Auschwitz, and he went voluntarily as part of the resistance. He smuggled out a series of reports on what was really going on inside the camp. Documents made their way to the outside world in 1940, 1941, and 1942, and after his escape in 1943, he wrote more. The result is an eyewitness account of the horrors, starting with the public execution of some of the camp's Polish prisoners, who were sometimes shot and sometimes left to the elements. Later, Pilecki saw the focus shift to Jewish prisoners, writing, "Over 1,000 a day from the new transports were gassed. The corpses were burnt in the new crematoria." While fighting typhus and surviving beatings, Pilecki organized a resistance network within the camp, in addition to sending messages. The first message read, "Bomb Auschwitz." Pilecki escaped in 1943 and lived to see the end of the war and the liberation of the camp, but his commitment to the idea of a free and independent Poland was seen as problematic. In 1947, he was arrested by the communist leadership, tortured, and declared an enemy of the state. He was executed the following year. According to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, around 23,000 Roma were sent to Auschwitz, and 21,000 died there, but they were also part of an insanely brave rebellion. Most Roma were held in a section of Auschwitz called Zigeunerlager, a sort of holding center for entire families. It was established in 1942, and in 1944 it was decided that everyone in the camp was going to be executed, for the simple reason that the space was needed for more prisoners. At the time, there were around 6,000 Roma there. One day, after they were warned that their executions were imminent, around 600 armed themselves with hammers and shovels, barricaded themselves in their barracks, and told the Nazis that if they wanted to take them to the gas chambers, they'd better come in and get them. The date was May 16, 1944, and here's the incredible thing. According to the Council of Europe, they sort of won, at least temporarily. No one died that day, as had been planned. Instead, half the Roma prisoners were transferred to other camps. For the remaining half, the respite was merely a stay of execution. They were sent to the gas chambers a few months later. May 16th is now remembered as Romani Resistance Day for their attempts to stop the Nazis. The Sonderkommando were selected from amongst the healthiest men who were sent to Auschwitz. Some were promised their own survival, while others were told they could protect their families by working for the Nazis. They discovered very quickly that neither promise would be kept. The Sonderkommando were selected because of their strength. Part of their job was to lie to prisoners so they would stay calm while they escorted them to gas chambers. Afterwards, they removed the bodies. They would sort through clothes, collect valuables, extract any gold teeth, and carry the dead to the crematorium. Then, when the ashes began to pile up, they shoveled it into a nearby river. Every few months, a Sonderkommando would be executed and new prisoners took their place. By the time this had happened a few times, people knew what they were in for, so the 12th Sonderkommando decided to take some Nazis with them. Prisoners Rosa Rabata and sisters Esther and Hanka Weitzblum worked at a munitions factory where they, along with some co-conspirators, started smuggling gunpowder to the Sonderkommando.
They used this gunpowder and manufactured little hand grenades.
On October 7, 1944, Polish prisoners in Crematorium 1 grabbed a particularly sadistic guard and stuffed him in an oven. The workers at the other three crematoriums soon joined in. The gunpowder was taken to Crematorium 4. There, in a suicide mission, the Sonderkommando detonated the ovens. The crematorium would never be used again. When the Nazis regained control of the situation, 200 Sonderkommando were immediately executed. Their bodies were disposed of by the 13th Sonderkommando. The women involved were discovered and tortured, but never gave up the names of living conspirators. They were hanged on January 5, 1945.
Would have been gassed and burned in Crematorium Number 4 during the final months of the war.
Whenever new prisoners arrived at Auschwitz, Dr. Joseph Mengele was on the train platform waiting and watching. Among the things he was looking for were identical twins.
He demanded to know from my mother if we were twins. And my mother didn't know what to say. She asked if that was good.
Records indicate that Mengele experimented on 732 pairs of twins at Auschwitz, although some estimates place the number at around 1,500. Some of his subjects survived, and many later gave testimony about what was done to them, and it's pretty horrible. Some twins remembered being given injections that were supposed to change a person's eye color, while others were deliberately infected with a variety of diseases and substances. Twins would be measured and documented. Their reactions, sometimes to things like surgery without anesthetic and forced sterilization, would be recorded. Often, one twin would be used as a control subject while the other was experimented on. When that twin died, the other was killed and they were both autopsied, all with one goal in mind: to find new ways to advance the development of Hitler's master race.
You'll make twins with German women?
That's the goal.
Even though the only doctor you may have heard of was Joseph Mengele, he wasn't the only one performing medical experiments at Auschwitz. Karl Klauberg was working alongside Mengele in the area known as Block 10, and he was interested in finding an efficient way to sterilize large groups of people.
Block 10's main purpose was a secondary genocide, or in other words, killing the unborn.
Among his methods was a non-surgical procedure that introduced chemical irritants into the female reproductive organs. The inflammation it triggered caused swelling and sterility. It also caused quite a bit of death. Dr. Horst Schumann was working on the same project, only his methods involved exposing patients to X-rays in order to try and find just the right amount of radiation to sterilize without burning. This technique was deemed unsatisfactory as there were too many casualties. Dr. Johann Paul Kramer was starving prisoners to see what happened as people wasted away, and Dr. August Hirt took the opportunity to collect Jewish skeletons in the hopes of taking measurements that would confirm Jewish individuals were biologically different and therefore inferior to Aryans. Block 11 was a punishment block reserved for prisoners suspected of things like sabotage. Prisoners caught trying to escape were condemned to death by starvation and sent here to die in the aptly named dark cells. There were also so-called standing cells with floor space of less than a square meter where air entered through a single 5-centimeter square vent. As many as 4 prisoners at a time would be locked in that small space. Some were sent there for weeks at a time, usually just at night though, as they were required to work during the day. Block 11 was right next to Block 10, and they made up another infamous portion of Auschwitz, a place known as the Death Wall. Flogging was done in the courtyard. Prisoners were executed against the wall. Freddie Hirsch could have escaped. His mother, brother, and stepfather headed to Bolivia after Hitler's rise to power. He stayed behind in Germany and then ended up in Czechoslovakia, and it was there that he began his life's work, saving children. Hirsch was charming, and he used his personality to keep the Nazi guards at bay and keep his focus on the children. At first, he worked with the children in the Jewish ghettos. He made sure that they had personal hygiene items and that they continued their education and got daily exercise. In 1943, he was caught facilitating communication between Jewish children and Terezin in the outside world. He was sent to Auschwitz. Once there, he established the children's blocks, where kids would spend their days before returning to their parents in the barracks at night. In secret, he oversaw their continuing education and arranged for life-saving measures. Because of Hirsch, roll call was done indoors instead of outside in the rain and snow, and he secured a steady supply of extra food. Packages that came into the camp addressed to people who were already dead were redirected to the children. By the beginning of 1944, he was caring for hundreds, but this also coincided with his 6th-month anniversary at Auschwitz. Prisoners chosen for special treatment would be eliminated after 6 months. Hirsch had a few choices: join Auschwitz's underground resistance, lead a revolt, or try and escape. They gave him an hour to decide. When the hour was up, his body was discovered. No one is sure what happened to him. He either took his own life or a Jewish doctor facilitated his passing. Before his death, he appointed 2 successors to make sure his work protecting the children of Auschwitz continued. It's well known that concentration camp prisoners who were healthy enough to work were forced to do so, but it wasn't until fairly recently that another part of the Nazis' forced labor scheme came to light: Heinrich Himmler's reward plan. According to the Ravensbrück Center, Himmler decided female prisoners could be turned into sex workers. There were a few things likely at play here. For one, Himmler believed he could prevent homosexuality by making women available. And secondly, according to Reuters, he thought prisoners would work harder if they were promised a trip to the brothel at the end of the day. At the Auschwitz brothel, 21 women worked at the same time. Some, it was believed, volunteered, while others were escorted there only to realize where they were when their first client was shown in. The women who have spoken about their time working in a Nazi brothel described how they were forced to see as many as 10 men in a span of 2 hours. Some of the men, they said, just wanted to talk to a friendly person. On January 27, 1945, the 60th Army of the 1st Ukrainian Front became the first Allied troops to enter Auschwitz, and the Auschwitz-Birkenau Memorial Museum says that around 7,000 prisoners were waiting for them.
First thing we noticed is the turret was not aimed at us.
They were free, but thousands of others were still in hell. The Nazis knew the Soviet army was coming, so they tried to move around 56,000 prisoners deeper into German territory where they could still use them as forced laborers. We know it happened, but according to the New York Times, there was so much chaos and confusion that this is one of the least documented aspects of the Holocaust. We do know that only those thought strong enough to survive were taken. Still, it's estimated that around 15,000 people died during the death marches from Auschwitz alone. Some were shot as they passed through villages. After the death march had passed, the dead were collected and given a proper burial. Memorials mark the places where groups were executed, but for many others, nothing remains. When Witold Pilecki escaped and told the outside world what horrors were happening to Auschwitz, he begged the Allies to bomb the camp to put an end to the Nazi genocide. But Auschwitz was never bombed. Why? It's complicated. According to The Guardian, Pilecki wasn't alone. Representatives of the Jewish community also petitioned the U.S. War Department asking them to bomb the camp, but the U.S. declined. They claimed it would require precision bombing that was beyond their capabilities, and that the camp was well beyond the reach of their bombers. They said their air forces were needed elsewhere and that the mission posed too much of a danger to American troops.
Isn't this a thing for our Soviet allies anyway? Being much closer to the intended target than us, I mean.
According to the Jewish Virtual Library, however, there was another reason: the inevitability of civilian casualties. The question came up again and again, and in 1944 the answer was still no. But what about those who were in the camp? The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum says that some survivors recalled hearing nearby bombs and remembered the hope it gave them, saying, "We were no longer afraid of death. At any rate, not of that death. Every bomb that exploded filled us with joy." Who wouldn't want to fight Nazis? They were evil incarnate, and the world is obviously better off without them. But Americans at the time of World War II were skeptical. President Franklin Roosevelt was the most vocal supporter of joining the war effort, while aviator Charles Lindbergh was dead set against it.
We cannot win this war for England, regardless of how much assistance we send.
Lindbergh's vehement isolationism got him labeled as a Nazi sympathizer. You might have seen on your favorite internet search engine that Lindbergh just admired Germany for their technology and rejuvenated economy under Hitler, but he also thought white people were superior to everyone else, so yeah. Sounds pretty sympathetic. Lindbergh was complicated. He greatly criticized the German government for Kristallnacht and gets singled out today for some pro-Nazi leanings that aren't really there. But here's the thing, it was far more than just Lindbergh.
In February 1939, some 20,000 American Nazis rally in Madison Square Garden.
To lots of Americans, Europe seemed like another world, and it was their fight, not ours. Plus, a war meant another draft, and that was a deal breaker. College students figured they'd be the first to die, so students at Yale formed a large isolationist group called America First that quickly grew to over 800,000 members, including Gerald Ford, Gore Vidal, and John F. Kennedy. But many American Firsters were also anti-Semitic and pro-fascist, as were a large contingent of their leaders. In other words, up until the attack on Pearl Harbor, the conviction to fight for right wasn't nearly as universal as we'd like to believe. One of the worst disasters in American history, the Great Chicago Fire raged for 2 days in October 1871. Newspapers claimed a certain Mrs. O'Leary had been milking one of her cows on October 8th when either she or the animal knocked over a lantern and started the blaze. By the time it died down, 300 people were dead and around 100,000 were homeless. The fire ripped through 2,000 acres, leaving $200 million worth of property in ashes. Naturally, when something this horrible happens, people want a scapegoat, and this time it was Catherine O'Leary, an Irish immigrant who made her living selling milk. Mrs. O'Leary insisted that she'd been asleep the evening the fire started, probably because she got up early to milk her cows in the morning, and mostly because she was asleep when the fire started. Shortly after the fire, an official inquiry stated that there was no way to prove who or what started the fire. Of course, that didn't stop people from blaming O'Leary. When she finally died 24 years later, people said it was of a broken heart. Even today, it's widely and wrongly believed that O'Leary's bovine started the blaze. In fact, several reporters who first accused O'Leary admitted they'd either made up the story or heard it from super unreliable witnesses. And some have recently come to suspect her neighbor Daniel Pegleg Sullivan, the guy who first reported the fire.
Mrs. O'Leary! Mrs. O'Leary! Oh, Mrs. O'Leary! Your barn! Look!
Many parts of Sullivan's story don't stand up under scrutiny. But regardless of who or what was at fault, the Chicago City Council finally decided there was no good reason to blame O'Leary. So in 1997, they cleared both Catherine and her infamous long-dead cow. Rosa Parks is best remembered for refusing to give up her seat on the bus, challenging segregation, and sparking the Montgomery bus boycott. Many have assumed that Parks was a tired old woman who spontaneously decided she wasn't moving, but that's not the case. Parks herself clarified, "People always say that I didn't give up my seat because I was tired, but that isn't true. I was not tired physically, or no more tired than I usually was at the end of a working day. No, the only tired I was tired of giving in." When Parks was arrested for refusing to give up her seat, she was already a respected civil rights leader. Her choice to stay in her seat was a calculated decision and a brave act of protest, not a spontaneous decision. We're not downplaying Rosa Parks or the Montgomery bus boycott, so don't get it twisted. For one thing, Parks was actually in the designated black section of the bus when asked to move. In those days, if the white section filled up, they just sat in the front of the black section. Parks in the Montgomery chapter of the NAACP knew this would happen and planted her in the right spot to get things started. This was a calculated move, quite ingenious, that was inspired by a few prior events. One of those events was undoubtedly a spontaneous decision. 15-year-old Claudette Colvin flat out said no way when told to get up.
Hey, you guys have to move because I'm white.
After learning about black history in school, Colvin refused to submit to the racist policy on her local bus and give up her seat for a white passenger.
You know what? I paid my fare the same as this white lady paid her fare, so Claudette's like, have a seat.
In an interview with NPR, Colvin stated, "It felt like Sojourner Truth was on one side pushing me down and Harriet Tubman was on the other side of me pushing me down. I couldn't get up." Why wasn't Colvin made the face of the movement? For one thing, she was young. She was also, and I'm quoting the community leaders here, feisty and uncontrollable. She later became pregnant while still a teen, but that wasn't really a factor. Parks, a calm and determined leader, was a better choice to those in the movement.
The Pilgrims was a bunch of people who wear bell buckles on their head.
Remember elementary school when you dressed up like pilgrims in ill-fitting black and white costumes and big black hats to reenact the first Thanksgiving? Newsflash, the wardrobe wasn't historically accurate, but it's probably best not to tell the moms who sewed their fingers off to get it all done. It's reasonable to assume that pilgrims dressed that way, mindful, demure clothes for mindful, demure people. Except according to historian Caleb Johnson, the pilgrims wore all kinds of styles and colors. The idea that pilgrims dressed like they were colorblind came much later. In the early 1800s, artists like Michel Felice Cornet painted the pilgrims with no real idea what they looked like, so they stuffed them into clothing that was modern and familiar, all that black and white stuff. The minimal women's history you learn in schools usually revolves around the idea that ladies stayed at home, then for a minute they had to go to work in the factories and wear red bandanas during World War II, but they went back home after the war and stayed put until feminism came along. Nope. Not even close. Okay, lots of women were housewives or mothers and not allowed or not encouraged to work after getting married. But what about the other women? The ones who didn't have the privilege of not working? What about the decades of history where men and women worked equally?
Notice how anger is your emotional response to any female challenge to your authority.
That's right. Before the Industrial Revolution, work was an extension of the household and tasks were split evenly between men and women. Even by the turn of the century, women held a quarter of industrial jobs and half of agrarian jobs. Factory work at the time was incredibly dangerous, and gendered labor laws reinforced the growing idea that men should earn the money and women should stay at home.
Do women climb Mount Everest or fly around in Gemini space capsules?
Not yet, but only because conservative males boycott us from our rightful place in the universe.
Even in the 50s, women workers weren't so rare. Look magazine often profiled female workers, and radio programs talked to career girls who felt women should be able to find meaning and purpose outside the home. The important thing is that the working girls got erased, making women seem like frail, put-upon creatures of history till they finally had enough and demanded equal rights. The first women's rights convention in the U.S. was in 1848, and they'd been working long before that. Rosie the Riveter was a marketing ploy more than a movement. In 1903, baseball guide editor Henry Chadwick wrote about how baseball had evolved from the British games of cricket and rounders. The magazine's publisher, sporting goods kingpin Albert Spalding, objected. According to him, baseball was American and simply had to have American origins. Spalding set out to prove it, forming a commission that asked the public for information about the game's early days. The commission's report, issued in 1907, was based mainly on a letter from a man named Abner Graves. He claimed to have been in Cooperstown, New York in 1839 when future Civil War General Abner Doubleday outlined the diamond in the dirt and wrote up rules for a game called baseball.
Welcome, my friends, to the first ever playing of a new sport. A sport of my own devising.
Spaulding took this for fact. In doing so, he ignored two actual facts. That commission member A.G. Mills, who was close friends with Doubleday, couldn't remember Doubleday ever mentioning baseball, and that in 1839, Doubleday was a cadet at West Point, not in Cooperstown. All right, fine. I'll say it. That's 2 strikes against Spaulding's claims. In the mid-1930s, Major League Baseball made plans to celebrate the 100th anniversary of Doubleday's invention. That's when Baseball Commissioner Kennesaw Mountain Landis got a letter from a man named Bruce Cartwright. He claimed his grandfather, Alexander Cartwright, invented baseball and that he could prove it with the original written rules, a field diagram, and a scorecard from the first game, played in Hoboken in 1845. The Hall of Fame honored Cartwright for his contributions, but Doubleday remains the inventor of baseball in the court of public opinion. The 2 most well-known facts about Marie Antoinette are probably that she was guillotined during the French Revolution, and that, when warned that her people were starving and running out of bread, she replied,
"Let them eat cake."
While there's no doubt that Marie Antoinette was born into extreme privilege and likely had no comprehension of the struggles her people faced, she almost definitively never said those words. While today, almost everyone associates this phrase with Marie Antoinette, it's actually been attributed to many noblewomen throughout history, long before Marie Antoinette was even born. It's likely that the story became associated with the beheaded queen, both because it fit well with her reputation as a vapid, rich woman from a foreign country who was sending France headlong into debt, and because the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau claimed that it had been spoken by a princess, and some mistakenly assumed he was referring to her. Funny thing is, she probably didn't say anything, which isn't any better when you think about it. July 14th, that's Bastille Day, marking the day the French stormed the Bastille to free the unjustly imprisoned and start a revolution, or so you think. After King Louis XVI dragged the nation into poverty, then raised taxes sky high to cover his butt, the people of France were pissed. And on July 14th, 1789, they fought back. But here's the thing. The Bastille was once full of political prisoners, but by 1789, there were just a handful of prisoners left inside. When revolutionaries stormed the place, it wasn't to free prisoners. They showed up to get more gunpowder. The raid turned violent, and the freedom fighters killed, then beheaded the prison guards while, as a side benefit, freeing the remaining inmates. The whole thing was just a case of looting gone wrong. Fortunately for the citizens, the Bastille raid came at the right time, so it turned from a tale about stealing gunpowder and lopping off random heads into a legendary fight against tyranny. They controlled the narrative, so to speak. So when you're celebrating Bastille Day with your 3-foot baguette and most fetching beret, remember, you're really honoring a bunch of beheading-crazed looters with a whopper of a revolutionary excuse. The idea that Gandhi was anything less than pure and perfect used to feel like heresy. But few historical figures have experienced a plot twist quite like Gandhi. In fact, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Joseph Lelyveld's realistic biography of Gandhi has been banned in Gandhi's home state of Gujarat for blasphemy. But that doesn't make Lelyveld's words any less true.
He was viewed alternatively as a fanatic or an eccentric, a reactionary, revolutionary, saint or messiah, or as a man who must be killed.
Most of us don't know Gandhi abandoned his wife to live with a rich male architect before he got involved in British-Indian relations. But Gandhi's sexuality isn't the issue here. The problem is that Gandhi tried to get all references to homosexual traditions erased from Indian temples in an act he called sexual cleansing. And according to Lelyveld, to test his resistance to sexual temptation, he'd sleep in bed naked with his teenage grandnieces. To be fair, the evidence of actual sexual relations Gandhi had with any of the aforementioned is not strong. What is strong is stuff that looks like flat-out racism. Gandhi may have wanted India free of British rule, but he was perfectly happy with the country's rigid caste system. Gandhi wrote of a time when he and his followers were locked up in a lower caste jail for protesting, saying, "We can understand not being classed with whites, but to be placed on the same level as the natives seemed too much to put up with. They're troublesome, very dirty, and live like animals." When asked about Indian views on race versus those of white South Africans, he wrote, "We believe as much in the purity of races as we think they do." Gandhi referred to the black South Africans by a slur that I'm not going to say or define, but let's just say he didn't respect them. There's no denying the good Gandhi did for the world, but he was only human, and today he's more recalled for his negative aspects than what school books said 30 years ago about him. Without John F. Kennedy, we may never have had civil rights legislation, or so we've been taught. But when Kennedy heard about the planned March on Washington, where Martin Luther King Jr. gave his I Have a Dream speech, he actually tried to stop it. He even sent Vice President Johnson to Norway during the march because he didn't like LBJ's pro-civil rights policies.
Each time a big issue came up, the president and the attorney general did everything they could not to have to get involved.
Kennedy was forced to act on civil rights after the Freedom Riders and the assassination of Medgar Evers, but he thought the legislation would fail and hurt his chances of passing the bills he really cared about. After Kennedy was assassinated, though, new President Johnson put all his effort behind the Civil Rights Act. LBJ used the people's grief over the loss of the beloved young president to get Congress to act, and in the end, JFK got all the credit. World War II is often considered the last war where the lines between good guys and bad guys were clear. The Axis powers wanted to take over the world. The Allies wanted to stop them. But nothing is ever that simple. American GIs were responsible for numerous war crimes as horrific as those committed by the Japanese and Germans. For example, in 1943, U.S. soldiers invaded the island of Sicily, and inspired by an intentionally ambiguous speech from General George S. Patton, murdered at least 77 POWs in what is known as the Biscari Massacre. It was even worse for European women. GIs were responsible for approximately 14,000 sexual assaults in England, Germany, and France from 1942 to 1945. But things took a truly barbaric turn in the Pacific Theater. Even though it was illegal, American troops made a habit of taking trophies from dead Japanese soldiers, and not by fumbling through their pockets or taking their weapons. GIs actually lopped off ears, pulled out teeth, and took bones as mementos to send to their parents, wives, and girlfriends. This behavior went all the way to the White House. In 1944, a congressman gave President Roosevelt a letter opener made from a Japanese arm, and the president responded with, "This is the sort of gift I like to get." Everybody knows the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. The surprise attack left over 2,000 Americans dead and finally forced the U.S. into World War II. But despite what many people think, it wasn't the last time the Japanese dropped bombs on U.S. soil. In February 1942, a Japanese sub fired a couple of shells at an oil field near Santa Barbara. Then in June, another sub lobbed explosives at a fort on the Columbia River. That same year, a pilot named Nobuo Fujita dropped 4 incendiary bombs into the forests of southern Oregon, hoping to spark massive fires. Thankfully, the woods were just too wet, but the Japanese had more success with their fugos, fire balloons that floated across the Pacific Ocean and landed on U.S. soil. While only one of around 6,000 balloons actually killed anyone, that fugo claimed the lives of a pregnant woman and 5 children in Oregon.
The nation was kept in the dark. No one wanted the Japanese to find out their devices worked.
Crazier still, the Japanese straight up invaded the Aleutian Islands and set up bases in the Alaskan Territory, prompting an island hopping campaign that stretched from June 1942 to August 1943. Of course, the Japanese weren't the only ones trying to bring down the US. The Nazis were involved too, only instead of dropping bombs, they were dropping saboteurs. In 1942, U-boats deposited 8 saboteurs in both Florida and New York. These agents planned on destroying as many railroads, bridges, hydroelectric plants, and factories as possible. They even wanted to shut down New York City's water supply. Fortunately, 2 of the spies got cold feet and sold their buddies out to the FBI before any damage was done.
Submarine saboteurs were in jail 2 weeks after they landed. 6 of the 8 were executed after a military trial.
By 1860, there were 4.4 million black people in the United States, and 3.9 million of them were enslaved. But there were a surprising number of slave owners who actually weren't white. Wanting to fit in with white society, wealthy members of the Cherokee Nation owned around 4,600 black slaves. The tribe even sided with the Confederacy during the Civil War because they didn't want to lose their slaves. Stranger still, in 1830, about 3,700 black freedmen owned slaves. In fairness, a few of them bought their own family members to protect them, but that wasn't always the case. Take William Ellison. One of the wealthiest men in South Carolina, Ellison was a black man who used his 63 slaves to work his 900 acres. And he wasn't at all concerned with keeping friends and family members safe. The guy just wanted free labor. And before Ellison was even born, there was Anthony Johnson, a black man who won a court decision in 1654 to keep a black indentured servant as a slave. As historian R. Halliburton Jr. points out, this was one of the first known legal sanctions of slavery and helped set the terrible precedent that would only end with the deadliest war in U.S. history. If slavery in America lasted around 250 years, why weren't there more slave revolts? Sure, there was Nat Turner's Rebellion and the Amistad Mutiny, but other than those 2 super famous incidents, why didn't more slaves fight back against their captors? They absolutely did. Some historians estimate that there were over 300 revolts and conspiracies, and while most of these were put down violently, a few were surprisingly successful. There was the Stono Rebellion of 1739, where around 100 slaves overthrew their white masters and fled for Spanish Florida, where slavery was illegal. These heroes were cut down by the English, but the group made history with the biggest slave rebellion in the 13 colonies. Then there was the German Coast Uprising of 1811, in which slaves attacked a militia warehouse, armed themselves to the teeth, and tried to capture New Orleans. They were defeated after 2 days, and around 100 black prisoners had their heads cut off and placed on poles along the side of the road. There was also the time 300 slaves teamed up with 20 Native Americans to seize a Florida fort, and there was an 1800 incident in which Gabriel Prosser assembled an army of 1,000 slaves but was undermined by a traitor and bad weather. In 1842, slaves turned on their Cherokee and Creek masters and made a brave but futile run for the Mexican border. On a happier note, in 1841, slaves aboard the ship Creole staged a mutiny and sailed to freedom in the Bahamas. And if you want to look outside the US, in 1791, Toussaint Louverture led a massive slave rebellion in Haiti, which led to the country's independence.
They fought the French, the British, and the Spanish army for 12 years.
Haiti was actually the second North American territory to gain independence, only behind the good old US of A. One of the most common myths about the colonial era is that indigenous Americans were baffled by European colonists because they had no concept of land ownership. Since they didn't understand owning property, they didn't realize the settlers were taking something away from them. Not true. In reality, many communities living in North America had extensive legal systems of their own before the arrival of Europeans. These included rules about owning land. As described in the American Historical Review, this belief that the people who lived in the Americas before the arrival of Europeans had no concept of owning land comes from philosopher John Locke, who believed that indigenous peoples were wild men who roamed the forest hunting and gathering and never worked the land. He believed that only white people cultivated crops. Turns out that the vast majority of people who lived in the Americas farmed, as in planting seeds and growing stuff. Even hunter-gatherer communities had designated land that they lived on, worked on, and maintained for future generations. Though school taught us differently, Southerners didn't get a patent on racism, and people of the North have their own terrible history of slavery. The colonial North thrived on the slave trade in the 1700s. During the Revolution, George Washington told Northern and Southern colonists that we must fight the British so we don't become as tame and abject slaves as the blacks we rule over with such arbitrary sway. By 1804, slavery was abolished in the North, but it didn't happen all at once. Some states left in provisions to slowly free slaves over time, and by 1840, Connecticut still had 17 slaves listed on the census. In 1740, a fifth of New York City's population were enslaved people, and New York had the second highest rate of slave ownership in the country, behind only Charleston, South Carolina. Slave labor built much of the city, and although they didn't have to work on plantations, you were still considered property to be bought, sold, and used isn't much consolation. Even during the Civil War, New York City came close to joining the secession after South Carolina. The city wanted to side with the South mostly for economic reasons, and they had no moral problem with the idea of siding with slaveholders. The New York Herald wrote, "If Lincoln is elected, you will have to compete with the labor of 4 million emancipated Negroes." So if a Yankee gets a little high and mighty around his Southern friends, just remind him of that quote and all the terrible history behind it, and watch the guilt make him spontaneously combust. Many believe that the Plymouth Colony Pilgrims gathered their savior Squanto and his tribe together for a massive feast to thank them for their help in growing crops. This story, while heartwarming, is total myth.
Hello, Englishman. I am Squanto. Perhaps we should strike a treaty between our peoples. Good idea.
The man we know as Squanto was actually a Wampanoag man named Tisquantum. He was able to help the Pilgrims not only avoid starvation, but also to communicate with the people who already lived there because he already spoke English himself. He learned the language after being kidnapped and trafficked as a slave by the British years before. Incredibly, he was able to escape and after working for a British merchant for many years, negotiated his way back home. Tragically, the arrival of Europeans in his homeland caused a massive epidemic that took the lives of tens of thousands. Without a family to return to Tisquantum, Squanto chose to help the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims really did have a harvest celebration, but they didn't invite the local people as a sign of gratitude for Squanto's help.
You have taken the land which is rightfully ours.
Celebratory gunfire from the Pilgrims was interpreted by the surviving Wampanoag as an act of war. After the conflict was resolved, it's possible that they provided some food to the Plymouth colony. But as a specific friendly singular gathering, the Thanksgiving celebrated today probably never happened.
Welcome to our banquet. Cheese, Mrs. Sowett. Thank you. Happy Thanksgiving, that's what we're calling it.
It's more likely that it memorializes several feasts of the Pilgrims, including one that celebrated the Mystic Massacre, in which colonists murdered several hundred Pequots in Connecticut as part of an ongoing conflict. But that Pequot War, it's complicated. We'll save that for another video one day.
The period of European exploration into the Americas was an ugly, bloody time. There was savagery on both sides, especially when it came to the subject of scalping. However, many believe Native Americans never practiced the awful art of taking scalps until their European enemies landed on their shores and showed them how it was done. The reality is more complicated, and scalping has been practiced for a long time. Archaeologists have discovered evidence of scalping being done in Europe from the Stone Age into at least the 11th century. And on the flip side of the ocean, in North America, archaeologists have found scalped skulls dating back to 1325 AD, long before Columbus, Europeans, and the relentless march through Native American lands. It's not clear just when scalping started, but historians have even discovered evidence that it occurred before the Vikings sailed across the Atlantic. And as historian James Axtell writes, by the time Europeans first showed up, they found certain tribes like the Delaware, Mohawks, and Algonquins already had scalping down to an art form. Once the Europeans moved in, everybody stepped up their scalping game. When white settlers arrived in the New World, they put out bounties for the hair and flesh of their Native American enemies, encouraging tribes that had never practiced scalping before to take up a bloody new hobby. Scalping became widespread across North America, resulting in a whole lot of bloodshed on both sides of the conflict. The infamous Salem witch trials kicked off in 1692, and they remain one of the darkest chapters in Massachusetts history. Before it was over, around 200 people were accused and tried for the rather difficult-to-prove crime of being witches, and many were executed in spite of a distinct lack of concrete evidence. 20 of the accused were found guilty and killed almost immediately, but none lost their lives by being burned at the stake like most people think. At least, none of the American victims did. In Europe, witch trials were all the rage, and they executed most of their victims with fire. In Salem, though, different methods were used to bring about the end of a perceived reign of witchy terror. 19 of the 20 victims were hanged on Gallows Hill, while the other victim, Giles Corey, was crushed to death with heavy rocks. When classrooms gloss through the women's liberation movement, one of the topics that almost always gets brought up is the movement's protest of the 1968 Miss America pageant. According to history, we're told that a bunch of protesters at the event took off their bras and immediately set fire to them. Well, according to Carol Hansich, one of the organizers of the protest, that's not exactly what went down. The truth, the women did want to burn their bras. Police wouldn't let them set things on fire while they were in public and standing on a boardwalk. They were forced to throw a bunch of iconic items like bras, girdles, and Playboy magazines into a garbage can. And that was finally set on fire. Hanish told NPR, "The media picked up on the bra part. I often say if they had called us girdle burners, every woman in America would have run to join us." First used in 1792, the guillotine hacked off around 15,000 heads during the French Revolution. It was so efficient, its final kill wasn't until the 1970s. It got its name from Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotin. But despite what most think, he didn't actually invent the machine. In fact, he didn't even like the idea of capital punishment. But in the early days of the French Revolution, Guillotin hoped to make the death penalty more humane by proposing a machine that could cleanly chop off someone's head in mere seconds, avoiding the prolonged suffering that came with most executions of the era. He pitched this idea in 1789, but the job of actually inventing the device fell to Dr. Antoine Louis, and the construction came thanks to one Tobias Schmidt. The completed product was labeled the Louisette, or the Louiot, after its actual inventor, and was tested on human bodies before claiming its first victim in 1792. However, because Guillotin was the man who originally proposed the idea, and thanks to a popular song incorrectly asserting he was the creator, people soon started calling the device Le Guillotine. Guillotin himself never approved of the use of his name. The Watergate cover-up is possibly the most notorious scandal in U.S. history, and when people recall the incredible events that led to Richard Nixon's resignation, they often picture a mysterious man lurking in the shadows of a parking garage, a secret informant who helped Washington Post reporters Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein uncover a real-life conspiracy. For years, this undercover agent was known solely as Deep Throat, and this enigmatic figure became a permanent part of the American consciousness. His true identity was finally revealed in 2005 as Mark Felt, the second highest-ranking member of the FBI during the 1970s. But even if Felt had never come forward, Deep Throat would have always been remembered as the mysterious informant that toppled a president, although that's not exactly what happened. While Deep Throat was an important player in the Watergate story, his role in Nixon's downfall has been massively overblown. As it turns out that for the most part, Deep Throat didn't provide Woodward and Bernstein with information they didn't already know. Instead, as Bernstein explained, Deep Throat largely confirmed information we had already gotten from other sources. Both reporters also made it clear that they already had numerous sources pointing them in the right direction. This portrait of Deep Throat as the man who brought down the White House just isn't accurate. Martin Luther King Jr.'s name is synonymous with noble ideas like civil disobedience and nonviolent resistance. King wrote the playbook on how to peacefully resist a totalitarian government, as demonstrated by his historic campaigns in Birmingham and Selma. During those marches, King and his followers never fought back. While he eventually became America's most famous pacifist, Dr. King wasn't always so easy to turn the other cheek. King first became a national figure thanks to the Montgomery bus boycott. After Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat for a white passenger, King organized the resistance movement that forced the city of Montgomery to integrate its bus systems. Needless to say, the boycott didn't win King any fans in the racist community, and as a result, someone bombed the Reverend's house in February 1956. But instead of letting things slide, King decided he would be ready the next time someone came for him or his family. After the attack, armed guards kept a vigilant eye on King, and he applied for a concealed carry permit. As you might expect, his application was denied, but that didn't stop King from stockpiling guns. UCLA professor Adam Winkler says one of King's advisors described his place as an arsenal, and once a journalist visiting King's home almost sat on the pastor's loaded pistol. Eventually, King would change his mind on the matter and get rid of his weapons, but for a brief moment, one of the most peaceful men on the planet was packing a whole lot of heat.
Taxation without representation.
Yeah, well, actually, that part was wrong. The Tea Act of 1773 that kicked off the infamous Tea Party was technically a tax cut, not a tax hike. Look, it's complicated. The tax cut wasn't designed to help regular Joe the tea drinker. It was actually to protect the bottom line of the British East India Company, which may have been the most powerful corporation in history.
Normally, British tea merchants sold tea to American traders in London at a markup, who would then sell the tea to colonists.
The British eventually realized that they could just sell their own tea to Americans, cutting out the middleman. And by cutting taxes on company tea, the British government made it possible for them to undercut the prices offered by merchants and smugglers who'd long brought untaxed tea into the colonies. Colonists saw this as a move to impose a monopoly that could leave them more dependent on Britain and undercut the protests against a lack of representation without taxation. That catchphrase was a bit too awesome to go so gently into the night, and no undercutting the black market by driving prices down just doesn't have the same ring to it. Organized protests in several colonies forced merchants to drive East India Company ships back to the mother country with all their tea still aboard. And Massachusetts colonists, including Samuel Adams, were hoping to do the same. But the colonial governor Thomas Hutchinson wouldn't permit the ships to leave, and Adams told an assembly that there was no hope of changing his mind. Soon after, the Tea Party broke out, with thousands of onlookers watching as their fellow Bostonians tossed the precious tea into the harbor. The musical Hamilton has done a lot to restore the Marquis de Lafayette's place in American history, but the French weren't the only foreign powers to support the colonies against Britain. Spain, France, and the Dutch Republic were all keen on checking the expansion of British power, and they all offered aid of one sort or another to the rebels. Spain sent arms early in the conflict and later entered a formal agreement with France to support the revolution. And Dutch merchants, albeit without official government permission, ran supplies and arms to the colonists. As the revolution dragged on, Britain was increasingly tempted to focus on new conquests rather than try and hold on to 13 colonies. A series of peace agreements around the globe saw America, Britain, Spain, and France all come away with something they wanted. But unfortunately for the Dutch, they ended up worse off after the conflict. The Founding Fathers knew their revolution was part of a broader international war, but over the course of the 19th century, American history books began forgetting the key roles played by their foreign allies. The British and French held more territory in North America than just the original 13 colonies, including some of what's now Canada. So why didn't the Canadian colonies join the US in the fight for freedom?
It's never going to happen.
Not wrong, mostly, but it wasn't for lack of trying on the rebels' part. The American colonists tried to convince them. And when that didn't work, the Continental Army made a lackluster and ultimately embarrassing attempt to invade Quebec, bringing with them a note from George Washington telling them to protect the Québécois. But in the great French tradition of non merci, we're good, they were semi-politely rebuffed. But the American colonists were nothing if not scrappy and perhaps a little entitled. So 2 years later, the Continental Congress ruled that Canada could join them as a state whenever it wanted without needing a 9-vote majority by the other states. The Canadians were, and remain, absolutely not interested. Well, except for Alberta, but that's for another video. Look, wars cost money, lots of it. Unsurprisingly and inconveniently, trade, particularly with Britain, collapsed immediately after the war. But the fresh new Articles of Confederation neglected to give Congress authority to collect taxes, and creditors wanted payback. So in a good effort to make good on their Revolutionary War bill, the new government borrowed from their French and Dutch allies. And when that wasn't enough, they simply printed more cash. But the more money they printed, the less it was worth.
There was no currency at the end of the war. It had lost all its value.
All these factors combined to send the United States into a severe economic depression in the 1780s. It was so dire that it's been compared to the Great Depression, as in the Great Depression. It was bad. But rather than cooperate in the face of economic hardship, the states competed with each other for economic advantage. Add to all this the fact that many soldiers who'd fought for the Republic were left with unpaid wages, and you've got a very disgruntled population. Things came to a head in 1786 with an armed uprising led by former Captain Daniel Shays, as in they named a rebellion after him. The too long did not read version is, a bunch of farmers in Massachusetts got tired of being taxed up to their eyebrows, so they did the sensible thing and tried to overthrow the government. While short-lived, Shays' rebellion inspired the creation of the U.S. Constitution by making it impossible for the young government to ignore its inability under the Articles of Confederation to handle the economic crisis. John Adams insisted that the day of celebration of American independence should be July 2nd, not the 4th. After all, the 2nd was the day the Continental Congress formally voted to adopt a resolution of independence. But the Declaration of Independence was only approved 2 days later, and it was the adoption of that document that cemented the commitment to liberty in the minds of many Americans, Adams' fellow founders included, and so the 4th of July became fixed as Independence Day by the early 19th century. But to get technical about it, many Americans assume that the Declaration was signed on July 4th, 1776. Not so. The version of the Declaration that went to the printers that July had only one name at the bottom, John Hancock, President of the Continental Congress. Other members of the Congress only began to sign later that August. And by that time, the makeup of the Congress had changed. Not everyone who signed the Declaration as part of their state delegation had been present for the original debate. Even if the signing had happened on the 4th, several delegates were absent and New York abstained from voting. History has its eyes on you, New York. It wasn't until January 1777 that a copy of the Declaration was published with the full list of signatures. Fun fact, Jonathan Dayton was the youngest signer. He was only 26 years old when he put pen to paper. Dayton, Ohio was named for him. Wasn't that fun? The larger war between European powers factored heavily in the decisions of Spain, France, and the Dutch Republic to support the American Revolution. But just as the revolution was one part of a larger war, it also represents a link in a chain of revolutions that swept across the world at the end of the 18th century and continued well into the 19th. In fact, the American Revolution impacted the French Revolution to a remarkable degree, including increasing France's debts under Louis XVI. Another ally, Spain, lost its American empire in a wave of wars of independence fought in Mexico, Chile, Argentina, and beyond. American influence was also evident in the successful Haitian Revolution that ended in 1804 and the unsuccessful Irish Rebellion of 1798. Brazil broke away from Portugal, and Greece, the homeland of so many ideas that inspired the Founding Fathers, won its independence from the Ottoman Empire after the American Revolution. Even back then, America was trendy. The divide between pro-independence colonists and those who wanted to stick with the British Empire is covered in most school curriculums on the American Revolution. But it was more complicated than it sounds. While democratic practice wasn't new to the colonies or to the British by the time of the American Revolution, it was far from a given that the United States could sustain a republic, or that everyone who even fought for independence wanted one. So there were three sides: those that wanted to stay with Britain, those who wanted what we have today, and that third faction that wanted a new king of their own. A number of Continental Army soldiers wanted to establish a constitutional monarchy with an American-born monarch. One even wrote to George Washington in 1782 encouraging the general to crown himself king.
The poet Robert Frost once remarked that George Washington was one of the few men in all of human history who was not carried away by power.
Thank goodness for that. Even after Washington firmly refused, the dream of an American monarchy didn't die. Tempted by an oxymoron known as enlightened despotism, a group led by Continental Congress President Nathan Gorham approached Prince Henry of Prussia about the king job. Henry declined just as Washington had, wisely intuiting that a people who just fought for independence from one king wouldn't be keen on another, although he did slyly suggest they ask the French instead. The Constitutional Convention never considered the concept of an American monarchy, at least not in those words, but Alexander Hamilton did float the idea of presidents that served for life, which is kind of the same thing when you think about it. If the nuances of the British and colonial positions in the American Revolution are often sanded away in the history books, the feelings of Native American groups are usually left out altogether.
Forget all that, kid!
The closest many lesson plans come to touching on Native involvement is explaining how the French and Indian War impacted the American Revolution. But natives were an active force in the conflict on both sides. Before the Revolution, the British government tried to keep the natives and colonists separated to prevent fighting. The large tracts of land reserved for the natives in the West were a sore spot for many Americans, so when the Revolution broke out, it was widely assumed that the natives would side with the Redcoats. But most tribes were neutral, at least at first. A few natives joined the rebels at Boston in 1775, but it took a while for most native nations to choose sides. While the British could point to their land policies to entice allies, and many natives saw an America without those treaties as the greater threat, the decision of who to fight for wasn't an easy one, and it caused several fractures within native communities. The Iroquois League split over the issue, as did the Cherokee Nation. Natives acted as scouts, foragers, and fighters on both sides. But whichever side they chose, the natives lost heavily in the aftermath when the British surrendered all of the Western territory they'd once kept the colonists from settling at the natives' expense. School books, popular history accounts, and Schoolhouse Rock all insist the American Revolution ended with the Battle of Yorktown. And yes, sort of. Yorktown did lead to the war's end. After the battle, the British forces were decimated. But the surrender of General Charles Cornwallis to George Washington wasn't the deciding factor in American independence. Cornwallis surrendered in October 1781, but serious peace negotiations between the two sides didn't begin until April 1782, and it took well over a year to draw up and sign the Treaty of Paris. Meanwhile, fighting continued on the seas and deep into the frontier of British-American territory. French and British ships traded fire, French forces attacked British Canada, and skirmishes between Native Americans, American loyalists, and colonial soldiers raged throughout the West.
Loyalists in the Carolinas and in Georgia wouldn't lay their arms down.
There were battles further west than Georgia, too. The furthest west battle was at Fort San Carlos. That's in modern-day St. Louis, as in the Missouri one. 1782 would later be dubbed the Bloody Year due to the intensity of the fighting that went on in unsettled territories. So the fighting went longer and further west than you ever imagined. The white leaders of the American Revolution were well aware of the contradiction slavery presented for a movement based on the ideals of liberty and equality.
Yes, you lay the evils of slavery at the feet of the king, but you say nothing of slavery itself, sir.
This hypocrisy didn't escape British notice either. A royal proclamation was issued promising freedom to any black American who fled their masters and fought with the Redcoats, and attracted some 100,000 people. But as early as the Battle of Lexington, there were black combatants on the side of the colonists. At first, some black Americans held out hope that the Founding Fathers' vision of America would mean their freedom. Even when that proved otherwise, between 5,000 and 8,000 African Americans participated in the revolution in some capacity. Not all of the white revolutionaries were thrilled by this, however. There was a real fear of arming slaves, even for the sake of independence, and the racism prevalent at the time left many in the Continental Army doubtful of the abilities of black soldiers. But as the war went on and colonial manpower was in short supply, they had no choice but to accept black men into the Army and Navy, and many served with distinction and won their freedom by the war's end.